to get advice about how you can be a better science communicator. Yeah, let me open it up to the audience. Dave, it's a question. Whoever wants to.
I've had a fair number of really horrible experiences speaking to the press, where the message has been completely distorted and ultimately is wrong. So what about how you control for oversimplification in these kinds of messages?
I think I would want to know more about what the particular story that you had in touch. I would want to go back with you and see where maybe the misstep was, so that we could then explore a different way around it. If there are things you can anticipate, like especially if it's a certain story that you're always saying and they're always getting wrong in different aspects, if you could anticipate where they might oversimplify, and you point that out to them, like, please don't, don't think that it means this. It's not as simple as that. You can, but I think for your kind of question, I would need to go back and know the exact kind of details about what it is that they're getting confused about.
Well, I don't, maybe it's the nature of different reporters, but I can remember speaking to some reporters for really relatively short periods of time and having them get the message right, and speaking to others for hours and thinking that I had gotten the message across, and it was almost completely wrong. Or, if not wrong, was filtered in such a way that I never got a chance to provide feedback to the reporters. So if there's a disconnect between the scientists and the reporters that are actually writing the stories, that really scares me.
Mm-hmm. So two things on that. I might wonder if the one that you had less time with got it right, and the one you had more time with got it wrong, you may have known that you only had a certain amount of time, so you had to tell them that message, and they didn't. If you remember back to that slide where there was so much information, you told them a few things, and you probably told them the key things, and they went with it. If they have an hour with you, they're learning all sorts of really interesting things, and they're drawing what they're most interested in and trying to piece it together. So if you're sitting, that doesn't mean don't sit down with someone for an hour, but it means if you do that, try and say up front, these are the key things. And then if it's been an hour, just say, tell me what you heard. What did you hear from all this that I've said? What are your key takeaways that you have sitting here talking to me? And then maybe you can get a sense of where they're going with that.
The key thing to me is that there's that back and forth after stories get developed. Mm-hmm. Because if it's one way and one time, and the reporters decide they've got the story and they know it, and they don't check back, right? That, to me, is really important.
Yeah. I'll let others comment, but unfortunately, most reporters don't. Sometimes it's against policies even to share the actual. This is what I've written. It's not a peer review process, but it's perfectly valid to ask them. Would you mind reading back my quote to me before this goes out? Just to make sure that I'm fairly portrayed. I think that's perfectly fine to ask.
I just think it's a problem in reporting.
Yeah.
So, as scientists, we are scientists because we have degrees and we have a certain type of training. What makes a reporter somebody that a scientist would want to talk to?
I could kind of say something to that, because I was actually really impressed at how much our producer went and read websites, read literature, asked me a lot of questions. So at least in that situation, it was like a science reporter who was kind of in the natural history area, and he seemed pretty comfortable with asking me a lot of those questions. Seemed to really do his homework, and I felt really comfortable with that. For that sort of life history type piece. But I don't know, I haven't ever had the experience of working with kind of something where I'm being quoted on some sort of policy or some sort of natural thing like that,
So can I just say that I think a lot of it has to do with the purpose of the article and what type of media it is. I mean, you were working with PBS, who, I mean, that's not your kind of run-of-the-mill newspaper, right? Their job is to sell papers, and the way they sell papers, at least in this country, is, you know, the worse the headline, you know, the more like scary the headline, the more people are going to read it. I had a school site where the headline said something like, "School to be built on toxic site." In the body of the article, they explained that the site was going to be, you know, I mean, it was a tiny site, it was going to be cleaned up, blah, 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 blah. But nobody seemingly got to that part of the article. They just read the headline. So it kind of depends on how they shape, you know, what their purpose is, what they're trying to push. And it may not necessarily be being accurate into the fact. It may be, oh wow, this sounds really exciting and people are going to want to read it. So in other words, I don't know the answer to your question.
I
Kind of
can chime in
depends.
a little bit on that. My experience with reporters has been that a lot of times it's perfectly okay to ask them what story they're trying to tell. And I always come at that from the angle of, I want to give you the best information that I have to help you get the best information out. And so I've had success actually asking people to kind of clue me into what it is that they're wanting to put together. And the other thing on getting reporters that get things wrong, they don't want to be wrong. So if they are wrong, it is absolutely okay to call them and say that they have captured something wrong and need to change it, or ask them to change it. I shouldn't say they need to change it, but ask them to. That has been my experience as well, that, you know, if you ask them to change it and you let them know that they didn't quite get it right, they don't want to get it wrong.
I just add to that. I think by and large, and we all have a story or have heard of a story where the media got something wrong and people kind of roll their eyes at the media. But with my interactions with the media, most of them truly do have a dedication to the truth. That's one of the reasons they're in it. They really do. Like she said, nobody wants to be wrong. Sometimes there's time constraints or misunderstandings, things that happen. Most of the time they are open to, I mean, certainly if they actually have gotten something wrong, they want to change it. With online, you can do that quickly. For the most part, you can just change it or delete it or whatever. But I think most of the time they're very genuine in wanting to tell the real story. And you ask, you know, kind of what makes them worth talking to. I mean, a lot of journalists do go to school and get journalism degrees. I have one. But now, I mean, anybody can, in some ways, anybody can be a journalist, and because of the era that we're in now, what makes them worth talking to? I mean, I would think almost in some ways, almost anyone's worth talking to, because you have the ability to share information and spread it wider. So if you can lend something to that and a clear understanding, I mean, and you have the time for it, then I would encourage people to do that. But then, of course, on top of that, and part of journalists, there are some that you might feel more comfortable talking with or not, and you can look at their reputation. Like she said, the PBS, KQED, they're most likely going to do a really good, careful job. There's a lot of wonderful science reporters out there. I'm so impressed with so many of them. But there's some other places that you kind of know by reputation you got to be really careful with, and ask about the angle of the story, and make sure you've got your, you know, you do a little more prep work ahead of time before you talk with them, because they might be a little less careful. So there's no one thing for any of it.
So I'm a geologist, and I'm going to stand on a soapbox for about 15 seconds. I think as scientists, it's our duty to the public to educate them. I've stood at an overlook in a national park and heard parents telling their kids, like, oh, look, and they're trying to read the panel and understand what the volcano is and how it's erupting, and I just happened to, like, saddle over to them and be, oh, by the way, here's a couple more things. And you kind of start, give them like 20 seconds, give them a taste, and then educate them and see if they're interested, and then run with it. Because this is a response to your question, why should we talk to them? I think it's our job. If we don't do it, if you ask yourself, like, you know, in that role when I'm standing there, and I see that family, if I don't do it, no one will. So I think that's a job for all of us. If you don't do it, no one will, and that's not good. So.
Or someone else will, and they'll get it wrong.
So this is kind of semi-question, semi-comment. I guess it's mostly directed at Kat, because she brought up something based on Dave's comment, and it reflects an experience I had. I've learned to not feel comfortable talking to reporters about my work because they just seem to have a policy where they will not let you look at it before it's published. And to me, that is so unnatural and frightening, especially if I'm going to be quoted. If my name is going to be in there and they say something wrong, and so I'm kind of curious. I mean, I realize how it might be sort of clunky and inconvenient for them to give you an opportunity to take a look at it before it goes to press, but that just seems like such a terrible, terrible policy. I'm having so much trouble understanding it.
Yeah, I think it is hard for scientists to understand that because you guys are in this peer review world, right, where you have multiple people looking at everything that goes out. For journalists, it has to do with, it's imperfect, but sometimes what's happened, and I saw this as a journalist, the scientists will try and change what they said, or they don't like not so much for inaccuracy, but because they just don't. The journalists are trying to, like I say, they're shooting to find the truth of it, and it can get a little sticky and muddly when you start having other people peer review journalism. It's hard to have what are the words? I'm failing a little bit here myself here. It's a sticky situation when you start having sources approve their quotes. I mean, if you can take that, not just for scientists, but if you take that to extreme levels, if you start having to share and review what you put out before you put out it becomes, kind of a First Amendment thing. So it's unfortunate for a lot of people. I know a lot of people aren't comfortable with it, but like I said, there are some ways around that. Let the journalists know. I'm a little nervous to talk with certain press. Decline the interviews from the people who you don't trust. But if there's a good outlet that is interested, or you have a press officer who can vet it for you, or find out a little bit more, maybe wade into it easily. Think about practice your messaging beforehand, ask to see the quote. That at least lets them know that you're a little bit nervous and they need to take a little care for you. I think that you might be pleasantly surprised, but it sounds like you've been burned before.
I've had some negative experiences, and then when Dave made his comment, I'm like, okay, so this isn't isolated.
Yeah, and some of it's just with practice. I mean, I think part of this whole thing to me is something I didn't really hit on before, but like, why do we even do this? You said, I love what you said. Thank you for that. But Tessa Hill, she's one of our geologists here. She's a great science communicator. She was just on Science Friday a couple weeks ago. She views it as sort of a duty. She says she's publicly funded for most of her research and views it as, kind of taxpayer. It's her duty, civic duty, to tell people what she's finding. And she takes great care in making sure those messages are clear when she does tell them. But, there's many benefits to getting the word out there. I've had people, it's helped in their grant applications. It's helped in their, helped some of them get jobs when they're postdocs. They show like all of the clips that they've gotten. It's been part of their resume. You get invitations to speak places. Your world can open up more. You meet more people because they've heard about you and you've read about you. And then, of course, that whole part about your science is actually getting out there. And so there's many benefits to getting it out there. Some are financial related. Some are not so much the ego related. It's really about the sharing of information. But a lot of great opportunities can open up when you do that too. But sometimes you do get burned, and there are ways, like we said, you can backtrack with that reporter and think about how to go forward moving forth. And sorry, go ahead.
So, playing on what you just said, I don't know how much of the meeting you were able to attend, but maybe since we're getting to the end now, you could finish up by giving us some suggestions of all the things we talked about here. What would be some good strategies or ways that we could get the word about what we've just talked about for 2 days out there to a broader audience?
Okay, I can speak a little bit to the experience that I've had at Sierra Nevada Conservancy, and one of the things that's been really successful for us is kind of connecting the science. I think, like I said in some of my closing statements, it's important for people to understand the whole story, and your research is one piece of the bigger story. And what we have experienced is that when you connect all of the other science that, is kind of keeping your piece moving, it's been really successful for us trying to kind of really communicate what the real issues are. We did a report called The State of the Sierra Nevadas Forests, and it ultimately connected all of the research that we knew about that was related to wildfire and water impacts and carbon impacts and a whole bunch of different research that we had been tracking that hadn't all ever been put in one place. So I would say that if you can connect it to a bigger picture, it helps kind of tell that bigger story. It's been my experience.
I have a few little. There's so many tools right now that you as scientists can use to get your word out. And if you have press officers and you have studies coming up or really great works in progress, tell them about it. Be sure and tell them why it matters. That's one kind of old school approach. Journalists love to get out and play with you. They really, really do. They love a good excuse to get out of the office. If you're doing some cool field work that has impact and value, you might consider targeting somebody and inviting them to come along with you. They give them enough advance notice. They would love to spend some time out in the field with you. They just, truly, they love it. And they'll write a much better story for it because it'll mean more to them, and you'll build all that trust I talked about. And so that's really fun. You have to pick and choose those carefully. Get on Twitter. That sounds kind of silly, but there's a lot of conversations happening on there. And when your science does get out to the world, people are looking toward there to talk with you about it and about you about it. And when you're at conferences, a lot of the conversations, you're probably missing out on them because a lot of them are happening on Twitter now. So that's an easy thing that you can do, whether you're an active person on there or not. There's a lot of blogs, like through Medium and The Conversation, that are looking for scientists to write kind of opinion articles or just articles. And so that's another approach that you could take. There's a lot of different tools out there for you.
Okay, we should wrap it up.